So I'm standing there over top of Mom. She had just gotten out of a surgery. And just so everybody who's listening understands, it's important that she's my mom. She's just had this really difficult surgery, and she's just kind of coming out of anesthesia. And the nurse is talking to her about, her children. And she says, well, she doesn't have any children. She has 5 wonderful grandchildren, but no children, And the nurse looks at me like, what? And, to me, I just kind of laughed, because that was really who she was. She really, really enjoyed her grandchildren. And my brother and I, she loved us to death. And, we couldn't be more blessed to have her and her power and her passion raise us. But we were kind of an afterthought, later on once the grandchildren came. And I share that story because it really kind of went through to her estate planning. When she passed away, she made the decision to give everything to her grandchildren and not to Buddy and I. And that I think, had a lot of merit, partly because of really just, understanding that you grandkids were probably at an age that you could use it more than Buddy and I could. But this episode of Hey Woman is really dedicated to kind of looking at those questions of, what happens if somebody dies? What do we do with this stuff? How do we make sure it goes to the right people? And then, also, what if you don't die and you get sick? And what do we need to do to kind of be planning for that?
As a grandchild, I think her reasoning was sound. You would. And so, I see no issues with what she decided to do. I think before we jump into the little bit more legal stuff, I think it's important for the listeners to kind of get reacquainted with Nan, because she authentically made decisions about who she was throughout her entire planning process. And so I think understanding a little bit about her and a little bit about why we decided to share all of these intimate details about her estate plan on a podcast is really important. So my name's Cortney, and I'm here with my mom, Julie, and we're here with the Hey Woman podcast, which we started a couple of months ago after my Nan passed away in December of 2024. And we really decided that, we both knew what we were doing. I am the CFO of an elder law firm. You are the managing partner of the same firm. And, we spend our days, working within this space, very comfortable with death, with dying, with understanding what the resources are out there for different people. And it was still really freaking hard.
It was.
And so, we're here to kind of shed light on the difficult emotions that happening in caregiving, in grief. And, it kind of was hard the whole way through. And so, Hey Woman comes from, that's what we used to call her. So we used to call my Nan Woman, and that's what we would say when we would kind of bust a move into her apartment. Or
Hey Woman. She loved that.
Or if we were calling her, you'd pick up the phone when she called and you'd say, hey woman, how are you doing? And so,
I think the funniest is I used to call her and say, hey woman, it's me. And me, you, and Steph all sounded like, but she always knew it was me.
Or she just called her favorite back. We all would leave a voicemail.
If you left a message, she just did call her favorite back.
Because we all do sound very similar. So, I think it's important for our listeners to understand, who she was and why we decided to do this. We're in no way sitting up here saying that all the decisions that we made were great or perfect. But we're hoping that it opens up the door to the fact that what you're going through as a caregiver is sometimes really lonely, and you're not alone while you do it. And it's okay that whatever emotion that you're feeling, and sometimes you're feeling 8 of them at the same time, whatever it is really okay. And you kind of have to walk through that, and nobody can walk through it for you, but we can help you and just say that what you're dealing with, is normal, and it probably feels the most abnormal of anything that you've done. So I don't know if you want to start with our lovely questions of what happens if you get sick or what happens if you die.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand, I get a lot of questions about, what happens when I die? Do I need a will? Those types of things. And I would say to, most everybody, you do need a will. Otherwise, your stuff, money, your belongings, possessions are going to go to whatever the intestate law in your state takes it to. And, typically in most states, that's going to be some part of a family tree. If you have children if you have a spouse to a spouse, if you have children, to children, if not, if you don't have either of those things, back up to parents, and then, out to siblings, and then nieces and nephews, and depending on who you have. But when you put like a second marriage in there, it's in some states it's going to put it to some to a spouse, some to children. And so we want to make sure that, one, you need a will to say, this is where I want my stuff to go. Also, we don't want to have intestate succession because that always takes more. And, doing a will, doing your planning is really a gift to the caregiver or to your beneficiaries themselves to make it easier. Just even knowing what's out there, how we do it. So a will is just a document that says, here's where I want my stuff to go. Here's who I want to get. And then the executor of a will say, here's the decision maker. Here's who I want to be making those decisions upon my passing. And we can talk a little bit about, who that decision maker should be. I mean, I'm sure you think it should be you, but
I would make good decisions on your behalf.
Yeah. For everybody, they have to decide, do they have one kid? Do they have all the kids? Do they not have a kid? If you don't have kids, is it nieces or nephews? Is it a professional? And that's a question that people should really think about. I'd encourage people not just to make it all their kids. An executor is a person that we want to follow a system, follow a set of rules, make sure things get done. But honestly, if there's any conflict, we want somebody who can communicate, hear other people, make some resolution. So, maybe that peacekeeper, kind of get it done peacekeeper would be a great choice. And it can be one person, can be more than one. But I don't want to spend too much time just, kind of on the will, because to be honest with you, although I sit here and say people need a will to say where stuff goes, often in most states, we want not to use the will in some ways. And so for many people, we're going to do a trust, or they're going to have beneficiary designations. And I want to talk a little bit about beneficiary designations, because this is one of those things that listening to this podcast, you could get off of here. Every one of us could do this and, just do this ourselves. So beneficiary designations say, if I have a life insurance, a bank account, I have an IRA, and some sort of financial asset, a beneficiary designation says this is who gets it. And that is in front of the will. So that controls even more than the will. Think of the will as a default document. And so often we'll use beneficiary designations because that avoids probates. That's beneficial. We don't have to go through that court process. For many situations, it's not going to avoid some of the taxes, and that's beyond the scope of this. But within the scope of this, of something I think everybody really needs to understand is making sure those beneficiary designations are up to date is actually really important. So in my career, I've had people who have had their ex-spouses as beneficiaries. I remember this one person, he came in and he was divorced and remarried, and he was dying of cancer. It was a sad situation. And so one of the things we did is we checked his beneficiary designations, and on one of his documents, on one of his assets, it was still his ex-wife.
Oh.
I thought the new wife was going to kill him that day in my office, not the cancer. And please know, I don't think he meant that. I think it's just something he didn't think about. He had went and done a new will. And I think in his mind, that will kind of changed everything. And that's not what happens. And I want people to know that. So everybody can look up your own beneficiary designations. If you work with a financial advisor or you're doing something online, you should be able to look at that and find out what it says right now. And it could be a situation where it's not updated. But also, and of course, this is within your world of data and stuff, a lot of these companies are being bought and sold. And if I have a beneficiary designation with company A and company B buys it, when it goes to company B's record, that beneficiary designation might go with it and it may not. We actually have situations where we've sent in new beneficiary designations. Somebody's passed away And what they have on record, that new company, doesn't match.
I think that's really important for people to know, because lots of times you have to like mail the forms in. And so this is a time where like you want to actually like keep a photocopy of the forms that you send in. You maybe want to send it with some sort of tracking, like via a FedEx envelope or something, to make sure that like you can prove that it got to the company and saving all of that information. Because I am shocked how many times that happened, and I think a lot of people would be like, how many times I get a call from somebody in our estate administration department, so the team of people at our office that help people after their loved one has passed away, where the companies aren't updating the beneficiary designation, and then the money's going to the wrong person. And once the money's distributed,
it's hard to get it back.
It's really hard to get it back, especially, in the cases of divorce. If it's not a nice divorce, it's not the easiest thing to call somebody and say, hey, I know you got this $10,000 life insurance policy. I'm going to need that back.
Yeah. People aren't usually like, oh, I'll send it right back to you. Yeah, I mean, and please know, it's also, we joke about it a little bit, but it also could be hurt feelings. I've had situations where it was going to go to one person, and then the loved one decided it should go someplace else. Well, it's really hard to know, like, I was chosen and then it was changed, right. And I could get mad at who it was changed to, or I could be mad at myself. Maybe I didn't visit. We don't know what the reasons are. But I just think in today's world, it's really important that everybody know that a will's not going to set aside those beneficiary designations. And it's something that you should look into. It's something you should look online. However, sometimes it's yearly. Sometimes you have to call the companies. And please know what I'm saying to you is not easy. Like calling a company and, figuring it out, or remembering your password for your online account. But my message to you is that it's worth the time to verify those things. And if you're caregiving for somebody, making sure that those things are verified. So the person that you're caring for may say, oh yeah, we already have that in place. And that could be true, that they think that it's in place. But it's just good to update, verify, make sure that everything, all the records reflect what we first thought.
I also think, just taking a step back here, changing your beneficiary designations is really good, but there's a step before that I don't want people to miss, which is just compiling the list of, like, I'm sitting here thinking, like, gosh, like, do I have the list of like all of my life insurance policies, what companies they're at? Because mine, the one that you bought for me, when I was a really little kid, that company has been bought and sold. And I think the agent that you use, like, he retired. And so, like, do I even have the most like up-to-date information in a place that somebody would know where to find it? So I think even before like updating the beneficiary designations, do you know about all the life insurance policies that somebody has, or all of the bank accounts and different things like that? So when you come into our office, we create what we call an asset list, which is just a listing of all of your assets, all your bank accounts, and different things like that.
And honestly, all that is like organizing somebody. And to be honest with you, when somebody passes away, often that list that identifies the assets is really, really valuable, because it could be like little savings bonds, or a small little life insurance from employment, or a small life insurance from childhood. That people just forget about. And if we don't know about them, we can't claim them. So yeah, you're right. Like, just compiling that list is really, really important.
I also think if you're sitting here like listening to this and you're on the younger side, like I think about, so many people that work in like the tech space or different things like that. So we're talking about, if you're caring for somebody, making sure that they have it. But I think even making sure for yourself, like lots of times when people work in the tech space, they get, stock options and like all kinds of stuff, which, goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But any sort of list of retirement accounts that are, maybe you were at a job for a little bit and you moved to another one, and so you have a small like retirement account sitting here. Just keeping that whole list in one place, I think, is really important and really helpful, and it allows you to make any kinds of updates, or if you need more sophisticated planning, it at least gives you a good place to start.
Yeah, and really at the end of the day, we don't want to waste anything people have.
Right.
And so sometimes I have situations where, we didn't know about like a savings bond or something, and it might actually cost us more money to get to that when somebody passes away than it's worth. But if we had known about it prior to death, we could have put a beneficiary designation on it. We could have, avoided probate. We could have taken action that would preserve that. And everybody works really hard for their money, and so we wouldn't want to waste it. So in my mind, we end up wasting money because we haven't thought about these things or thought them through. So I think everybody should be understanding that. So we have a will, says where things go. We often want not to use a will and to avoid probate. And again, I'm not going to get too much into that because I could talk a whole episode about trust, and maybe we'll do one on that. But we do want, just as a simple thing, have that list. Make sure the beneficiary designations are up to date and are reflected on that list. And so the idea is like when you pass away, the stuff goes to who you want it to. So there's obviously like more advanced things of like, how do we get it there the simplest, most tax advantage manner possible? But this is just, kind of the base of all of that. And fundamental to what I do as an elder law attorney, what happens when I pass away? Who gets it? Where's it supposed to go? And that's just a really, really important question. And the point of this, episode is just to, say to people, planning ahead is important. And I know it's hard because we're talking about what happens if you die, and a lot of times we don't want to think about passing away. But the reason I think this is important is because I see so much waste when people don't plan ahead, and waste of money, in attorneys or companies that you have to pay to get bank statements, or you kind of have to pay for everything nowadays. But also waste of time of your loved ones, because this podcast is really about how difficult this whole journey is. And there's usually one or two people who, kind of lead that journey, and it kind of falls on them. And so it's a gift to that person who is going to be in charge, be that trustee, be that executor, have to make these decisions for it to be organized and planned out, because otherwise they spend a lot of time, even doing what we talked about first, which is, making the list.
Right. And I think, it's important to be strategic about who you're picking as beneficiary designation. So lots of people will pick a spouse or something like that. And I think that there's merit there, right? At different phases of your life, it makes sense to pick different people. You might also pick children or grandchildren. You could also pick like the person who would take care of your children if something happened to you. You'd want them to get the life insurance money to take care of your kids. And that can be where things change as people get older. Once your kids turn 18, well, it doesn't have to go to that person anymore, right? Because they're no longer taking care of your kids. It can go to your kids directly. So, and I think this is about being strategic and having these conversations, because it's a couple of different things, but one of the biggest things is that it's your stuff and it should go or do like what you want it to do. But nobody can do that for you if they don't know. So the planning is important, but it's also being intentional. I also think this can feel like a daunting thing to do, especially if somebody has a lot of life insurance policies, or there's all kinds of different things, or you don't even know where to start, or maybe you don't have the best relationships, you don't even know how to have the conversation. If you start the conversation earlier, you're able to have it in smaller pieces, which sometimes feels more comfortable. You're also able to like semi-normalize it. And so it just becomes a part of your everyday routine. And so then it's not, well, I have to update my beneficiary designations in case I get hit by a bus. Mm-hmm. It's, I have to update my beneficiary designations because every year in February, that's what I do.
Right, exactly. And, it's hard you talk about doing this in pieces. So if you're caregiving for somebody, and maybe they're even at a place where they can't tell you all of this anymore. Some places to look is old tax returns, because they'll often have like 1099s that could show you bank statements, automatic withdrawals, seeing that money that's automatically withdrawing from an account. is, important for people to be looking at. And so to kind of put that together. So we want to think about, what happens when I die, and where do we want this stuff, and how do we get it there in the simplest, most tax advantage manner possible. But another question that we want to be thinking about isn't just what happens when I die, but also what happens if I get sick, and what planning do I need to do for that. And this is a really broad scope. We could talk about that question in lots of different ways. We could talk about it from a money standpoint. How do I pay for care, those types of things. But we also can talk about it like, how do I access, good care? And again, I think, this conversation starts at the same place, which is really assessing what I already have. Mm-hmm. So for most people listening to this podcast, if they're aging, they're going to have Medicare of some form. They could have an Advantage plan. They could have more traditional Medicare. They're going to have like Part A, Part B, and they're going to have probably some sort of a supplement. And we're first going to see, does that, what does that pay for? For other people, they may have a life insurance policy that has some sort of a long-term rider. And here's the thing. Some people may know that they have that. Some people may not know. They can be called a long-term rider. It could be called a terminal illness rider. But we want to be starting to look at those things and say, what do we even have? We also could have long-term care insurance itself. So it does start with this kind of base of what's even the options, or what's available, or, what's the list.
Absolutely. And I think, at the core of it, though, what happens if I get sick? Nan was so clear about what she wanted, and it never changed. At the core, what she wanted throughout her entire diagnosis and different things like that, it really didn't change, and she didn't change who she was as a person. And that made it easier, because when we were making decisions, we could go back to the same set of facts, or the same core belief that this was what she wanted, and therefore we were fighting for the right things.
That she liked her grandchildren better than her kids.
Well, we're lovely. And but I think for some people, it's important to sit back and think about what do you want? We talk about she was in a personal care home. For some people and for some cultures, that's not even an option.
Right.
And so, staying home is really the only thing that people want to do. And sometimes that's possible and sometimes that's not. But how do you do that for as long as possible? But I think getting really clear on what happens if I get sick is such a simple sentence or question, but it packs so much because it's so complicated. Well, what if I get sick and I only have 6 months is a very different conversation than what if I get a long-term diagnosis and I'm going to be sick for the next, 10 to 13 years. And how does that change throughout that time? And so really spending some time and thinking about, if this set of facts is true, then this is this is what I want, or this is what's really important to me, because at some point in time decisions are going to have to be made, and it's helpful to the caregiver if they know that they're going to be fighting for so many things. So if they know that they're fighting for what you want them to be fighting for, it kind of helps push that along.
Yeah, and I think, the exciting part of all of this right now is that there's so many options. And I see families approaching this so differently. When I started off as a social worker in a nursing home in the 1990s, people pretty much stayed at home, put their head in the sand, went to a nursing home, sometimes got stuck there. And, it was kind of like, that's where people are going to die then. If they got in, they weren't going to get out. And that's not true today. Nursing homes are, more rehab facilities many times. They still certainly have their space. But, even more recently, we're seeing more people doing, I've had clients who build granny flats, houses right by, small houses right by, a farmhouse. Or we certainly see situations where loved ones stay at home. We see situations where loved ones move in with a child or move in with a grandchild. We see grandchildren who are making decisions different than the generation above them, where they're more free and flexible in their work environments, and don't have as many like structured routes. And that flexibility ends up making them phenomenal caregivers, or being able to fulfill that gap. And so there's a lot of different options. I've seen people move close to a grandchild and enter a facility so that grandchild can help them, and maybe that's a better scenario than moving in with a child. So I think first of all, what does it look like? And you're so right, Court, that it can kind of depend on what we're dealing with. Is it a short amount of time? Is it a longer amount of time? But at the core is, what does that person want, and what do we want this journey to look like? And assessing then, what are the resources? So I started talking about, what do things pay for? And for most families, what they're going to find out is that there's not a lot of help.
Right.
Traditional Medicare, that system was built in the 1950s, and it addresses, more acute care. I fall, I get hurt, I get better. And not so much the long-term care, which is usually the caregiving that we end up talking about, or some component of that. And so for many situations, that's why this podcast is so important, because a lot of it ends up maybe falling on a family caregiver who's trying to raise their own family, also provide this care. And a better way to go about it is to say, okay, what really is the plan? And for me, we're finding more people, focusing on, well, I would like family members to provide my care. And in this country, that may become maybe an only option in the future, based on lots of things that are going on in the world right now, both payment structures that are changing because of changing laws, workforce shrinkage, for the current administration's stance on lots of different things, including immigration. And so what we know is that at some point in time, family caregivers may be one of the only options. But we also know that could be a favorite option for many people. But then the question is, if that's what we want, how do we do that? And in this country, historically, we've shied away from, oh no, we're not going to pay that family caregiver. And yet, maybe that's what we should be doing. Maybe we should be paying that person, because they're the ones that, has a job, trying to raise their own kids, and adding this extra stress. And, being so stressed out, we know that the stress of caregiving really affects longevity, affects long-term health. And so for me, kind of having that conversation or putting on the table that one of our options in this country is to have really clear conversations about, should we pay a family member to do that? And so it does go back to what you talked about. At the core is, what is that journey going to look like? Understanding that. And then what does the person that we're caregiving for want? And then starting to put that plan into motion.
I think, paying family caregivers is something that I think is very new, and it still feels uncomfortable for some people, because they don't feel like they should get paid for doing something that they feel so strongly for doing. Mm-hmm. I think the counter to that I think is really important to bring up is that, one, this really kind of becomes a part-time job. You're advocating at every turn in every system. Even with systems that have the best of intentions, you still have to advocate for what you want, for what your loved one wants. And that is hard, because it's conflict again and again. You're making decisions. And so putting your energy and time and effort into that, you can only do that in so many facets of your life. I think the other thing is that there's so many statistics out there about people that end up losing their job or get written up, and people that are good, hardworking employees that all of a sudden are on performance plans because they're late to work, because different things have happened, because they're a primary caregiver. And so I think, caregiving doesn't happen on a schedule. Mm-hmm. Emergencies pop up. They pop up the worst time. There's never a good time for an emergency, right? And so, paying somebody can take away that economic burden of the fact that maybe somebody needs a job and to do this. And it can make the experience better because now you've just alleviated this burden. They're getting paid to do it. They're able to, continue on like their quality of life and what they're accustomed to. And they also get to spend a better amount of time caring for somebody. And it can really make the experience better because instead of squeezing it in between work, now this is your sole focus. And so you have time to reach out to different people and have them help you. You're able to figure out like what the best thing is for that person. It becomes your job. And then I think you approach it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. Because instead of it just being one more thing, on top of already a busy life and schedule, it can become more like your focus. And please know, we're not here advocating that family caregivers should always be paid. We're just putting it on the table as something that should be discussed. And the reason I feel that way is because of a lifetime of honestly sitting across the table from caregivers that I admire greatly for what they do for their loved ones, admire greatly. The amount of work, the amount of dedication that they do. And there's no doubt they're doing it because they feel compelled to do it. Could be out of obligation. It could be out of respect, but there's no doubt they're not going to give up. But yet when we put that through the statistic that you see where, people are leaving jobs, we know that long-term care is one of the biggest workplace issues around. And if we just sit and think about it, it makes sense because, I've raised 3 children. And when you're caring for children, a lot of times you miss work, but, they're sick, they have a cold, they're going to get better.
Right.
I can go back to work and I don't have to worry about them as much because, they're going to get better. Now, certainly, and even me, I've had issues where there's a diagnosis that's a big deal that's not going to get better tomorrow. But even that often for many of us is a situation where it's a temporary in nature. But when we're caring for an aging loved one, often, we're going on a downhill. We're having a diagnosis that's not going to get better. We're interacting with a system that we don't understand, that's fragmented. And like you were talking about, that you really have to advocate. And so this is harder in some ways. The statistics would say that we miss more work today because of elder care. But I also think we also bring it back to work with us because our loved one is declining. And that makes it really difficult to perform for a long period of time at the same level. And so we already know that people are making decisions to leave work. We know some people aren't, but they're suffering at their job because they're now being written up for the first time, or they're taking a demotion, or they're giving up a promotion. And so we know it has an economic effect on people. And what I'm saying is that we need to acknowledge that.
Right.
Not judge it, but acknowledge it.
I also think there's some steps in between, like going from family members are taking care, they're just helping out, all of this stuff, to we're now going to pay a caregiver. It's funny when I think about Nan. So she lived on this farm. And, I will never own a piece of property in which I have to mow the lawn because I have been part of so many conversations about who's mowing the freaking lawn. Like, I actually just can't have the conversation about the lawn. But for Nan, it was a really big deal because, one, your lawn had to be like mowed at certain times, like perfectly the lines, and you had to alternate the lines, and you had to do it between the rainstorms, and like mowing a lawn was not like a simple thing for Nan.
I would like to put in here, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do have to put in here that although you grandchildren were perfect, nobody mowed the lawn as well as I did.
That's true, and she would say that nobody
on a diagonal. Nobody did it as well as I ever did.
In the big field, you did. But even so,
You're welcome to go on. I just wanted that acknowledged.
I think people have to understand, like, we're not talking about like push mowing like for a half an hour. We're talking about 3.5 hours on a riding lawnmower. If you're going relative, I think the issue is that we did it in 3.5 hours, and that's why our lines were never quite as nice as she would have anticipated them. But I think, that can be a great place for, some people pay a service to mow the lawn, to do the landscaping and pulling the weeds. That could be a great place for like a grandchild or a niece or a nephew that feels a little bit different, because you're not like caregiving, but paying them to clean the house, to mow the lawn, to do the landscaping, to kind of like take care of things. So one, that doesn't fall back on the main caregiver.
Right.
Two, you are probably going to pay a service to do it anyway. And it could be something where you can meet in the middle. You can save a little bit money because you're paying less than a service would. One, it's nice for your loved one, because then they see that like somebody that they care about cares about them. And it can give some money to people that might really need it. Like, it can be people that are going off to college or in high school or saving for a car. It can be a really great way to kind of get family members involved in a stepping stone to getting people comfortable, to getting paid for doing things around that house, if they're choosing to age in place and they're choosing to stay at home. The other thing I just have to laugh when you talk about the granny flats. There used to be this show on HGTV called Tiny Homes, and I always told Nan that like we were gonna build her one in like the field out behind our house, and she was so mad at me that we would even suggest like putting her in one of those like tiny houses. She's like, I would never. Honestly, those tiny homes are just as big as her apartment. Like, I'm not sure, like, right. But somehow being attached to a larger building made like the apartment much better than like the tiny. Maybe it was the fact that I was putting the tiny home out by the dog pen that like
I think that the placement wasn't optimal for her.
So if I had placed it elsewhere, but she could have had her own little like driveway and different things like that. So I just think she was, the granny flat would not have been for her. No.
I've had clients that it's worked very, very, very well for.
And I think more in like rural areas too, like, these conversations we're having, I grew up in a very rural area, and so we're making these decisions there. I think in the cities they're different, because
you're like mowing the lawn, but you're still taking care of the house. Like, your suggestions still work for that. And please know, like, again, we're not saying in every family like that we should be paying family members to do these types of things. But I also want to be honest and acknowledge that in some families, there could be 5 people available and only 2 are doing the work, and those 2 could get resentful.
Right.
Or they could not, because they feel like they shouldn't be resentful, but we're having an impact on their life. And so I'm just asking for real conversations about it. And so maybe, just really acknowledging what those other people are doing. So in every situation, it's going to be different. And I'm sure that there's people who are listening who are, thankfully thinking, oh, that doesn't happen in my family. Everybody pitches in. That's great. That's not always what we see. And if it's going to be a long-term journey, that's where I think like it's better to have these conversations, because we could lead to resentment, and what I see is that resentment ends up impacting relationships forever. Yeah. So we get through this caregiving journey, our loved one passes away, but that family's fractured. And it would have been better to have these conversations. Now, for any of them, and when I talk about the granny flat, please know or if we're talking about paying somebody, there has to be real conversations about what's expected and how's that going to work out, even for a granny flat. So, that's putting like another piece of a smaller house, a flat, on maybe an already existing piece of land. So there's all kinds of things that need to be talked about, like who's paying for the garbage, who's paying for the electric, who's paying for that actual addition, and then what happens to that when the loved one passes away. What are we paying? Which jobs are we paying for at the house? Is it, mowing the lawn? Is it cleaning? What are we paying? What are we paying for caregiving? So for these things to work, It's not something that we do like behind the backs of people. We have to be out there and talk about. And please know, these can be negotiations, like the one granny flat that I can think of. It ended up that, it was a really good family situation where they talked to each other. But there was a daughter-in-law involved who rightly didn't think she was being heard, and ended up getting her own attorney. And so I ended up having to talk to another attorney, and that whole situation almost fell apart. But it didn't. And I actually think that conversation ahead of time, where people acknowledge that they had a different idea, or like, oh, that wasn't what I was thinking. That happened, probably 5 years ago. And that situation is still very successful today. And I think the conversation earlier made it successful today. Because if we had went forward with it and people were on different pages and they couldn't get back together, then you'd have the whole situation blow up. And so communicating is so, so important in these situations about what's going on. And I say that, knowing how hard it is to have the energy to communicate.
It is. And I also think if you're the person that's in this conversation that's about to object to paying, to not paying, if you're throwing an objection in there, but you're not willing to be a part of the solution, that's really hard. So if you disagree fundamentally with paying a grandchild to mow the lawn, for example, that's okay. Everybody has a right to their own opinion, but you don't then get to pass off the mowing onto one of your siblings, right? So then you need to do it. I believe that sometimes what you see happen is people throw a wrench in a plan, or they throw up these objections because they're like, this could never work. And then they kind of slowly back out because they're like, well, I can't possibly do it. Mm-hmm. And I think when you go into these conversations, you have to really remember that you're trying to be solution-based for your loved one to have the best experience possible. And so just throwing up blanket objections to anything that we're talking about isn't helpful if you're not willing to also come with a solution, because there are other solutions to things that we're talking about. Paying people isn't always the answer. But if you're saying no to that, there's a cost to everything. So if you're saying no to that, then what is the other alternative? Because if the alternative is that somebody else picks it up for free and that negatively impacts their job, but you get to take your promotion, that's where the resentment that you were talking about earlier comes into play. Once people are resentful of each other, it's really hard to come back. And that makes everything more complicated. Like we've talked about, on other episodes, like funeral planning, we've talked about what to do with the stuff after somebody passes away. If you're resentful now in the caregiving journey, it just makes those conversations so much more difficult, because it's like, well, I feel entitled to this because I did all of this stuff and you didn't do anything. And, we talked about in those episodes, those are really more emotional decisions than they should be about what I feel entitled to.
Well, but it's hard when you've been the person who has been picking that up for that long. It's hard to get yourself out of it. And at the end of the day, the person who's at the center of this, the person that's aging, the person that we're caregiving for, I would guess that person really wants everybody to get along. Yep. That's a theme we see throughout, and they really want that person to get along, and that's not going to happen if that resentment sets in. And what I see is that families just kind of go their opposite ways. And so, they used to have holidays together, and now they don't. And not because their families have grown, but because I don't want to be in the room with that person because they weren't there for me. And that's not what we want. And if you're out there and in this situation, this podcast is really just to kind of let you know it's okay to feel the way you're feeling, however you feel. Nobody can judge whether or not what you're feeling is okay. And I would just say to you, sit with that feeling. And maybe something that you hear on this can help you take a step forward into some action. But even if just for today, we've said anything that, or on any of these episodes, that makes you think that you've been heard and that somebody else feels the way you do, it's okay.
It is. And so if you're sitting here listening and you're like, oh gosh, I can't even begin to have these conversations with my family, we do want to direct you to the planningandprotecting.com website. There are phenomenal resources. There's lists of attorneys. We have attorneys in lots of different states. You can also, send us an email and we can see if we have an attorney in your state if you don't see one listed on the site. If you're an elder law attorney that is listening and you're in a state that we don't have representation or in an area that we don't and you're interested, feel free to contact us. We're always happy to find more attorneys to connect people with because those professionals can really help in these instances. We also ask you to follow along on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook. We're always releasing new and exciting resources to kind of help you navigate these moments. And, we thank you for listening, and we hope we gave you a little bit of something to think about as you go along this journey.